My beloved, bring me away. Take me up to your resurrection place. My beloved, bring me away, 'cause I want to feel your light upon my face. There's a sun coming up in my soul, Lord, in my soul. There's a sun coming up in my soul, Lord, in my soul. My beloved, bring me away. Take me up to your resurrection place. My beloved, bring me away, 'cause I want to feel your light upon my face. There's a sun coming up in my soul, Lord, in my soul. There's a sun coming up in my soul, Lord, in my soul. I see the light, I see the light. I see the light, I see the light. Oh, thank you, God, I see the light. Whoa, hey, whoa, whoa. My beloved, take me away over Jordan and out of this place. My beloved, for you I'll wait, with you here till forever, face to face. There's a sun coming up in my soul, Lord, in my soul. There's a sun coming up in my soul, Lord, in my soul. I see the light, I see the light. I see the light, I see the light. Oh, thank you, God, I see the light. Whoa, hey. Whoa. And no more sorrow, no more pain, no more darkness weighing down on me. No longer blind, and now I see. Forever light, forever free. Yeah, I see the light, I see the light. I see the light, I see the light. Oh, thank you, God, I see the light. So, is everybody awake yet? Not quite what I was expecting, but we'll go with it. When darkness tries to roll over my bones, sorrow comes to steal the joy I own. When brokenness and pain is all I know, oh, I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. And shame no longer has a place to hide, and I am not a captive to the lies. I'm not afraid to leave my past behind. Oh, I won't be shaken. No, I won't be shaken. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out a grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. Power in your name. There's power that can break off every chain. There's power that can empty out a grave. There's resurrection power that can save. There's power in your name. Power in your name. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. 'Cause my fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. My fear doesn't stand a chance when I stand in your love. I'm standing in your love. I'm standing in your love. You may be seated.
Good morning, everybody.
Check 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Good morning.
There we are.
Welcome one another. Let's do an old-fashioned church greeting.
Make
Say
everybody
hi to-
feel awkward.
Yeah, let's make it a little awkward. Say hi to one another.
Hi.
All right, good job, church. Welcome, everybody. Now that you've welcomed each other, we want to welcome you and make sure that nobody feels overlooked. And if you're a visitor, we'd like you to take a connection card so we can connect with you and so you can find out the ways that you can get involved here and the different things that we have for you. So if you're new or you haven't filled out a connection card, please do that at the table in the back. We have a couple announcements for you here today, guys. And so our first announcement is the women's retreat's coming up quickly. Right, Steph? Steph, I saw you. There you are. Yeah, so it's coming up. It's going to be at Sylvan Hills, September 8th through the 10th, $60. So ladies, are you ready for an awesome weekend? Do you need some time away from kids?
Listen to the energy in the
Wow.
room. Wow.
Moms.
That's
you guys gotta
amazing.
Get more excited.
Do they need backup?
I think we need some backup. Oh, there we go. All right. All right. So if you're interested in that, is that in the bulletin?
There's a bulletin, a link right there you can scan.
All right.
Take you right to the
scan
registration.
the bulletin to register, please. And so also coming up, we have the PRC, the Pregnancy Resource Center, is having a 5K, and that's coming up on September 23rd. So if you're interested in running a 5K and supporting a great cause, we partner with the PRC here at Commonplaces. We believe in their mission, and so yeah, if you are available, please support that. That leads perfectly into an awesome opportunity for us to show up as a church in this community next Saturday, guys.
With this one coming up.
This coming up.
Yep.
This coming Saturday.
I always get confused with the next and the
yeah,
and the
me
this.
too. Me too.
Yeah.
So this coming, not yesterday, but the next one. Clinton County's having a night out, and it's going to be right in our backyard, right, Josh? Right.
That's right. Right
in
at
the
the
building.
right at the county offices
Yeah.
there.
So it's going to be happening there. We're going to have a table. We're going to be giving coffee out, and I think Peyton's going to be doing balloon animals. So if you have any hidden talent and you want to come hang out and serve,
Do
please
you
do
juggle?
that. Oh,
We got a juggler.
Yeah.
All
Avery.
right.
Play
So
with spoons.
we should probably tell them what the night out is.
Oh yeah.
So the night out is it's a night in which first responders and local law enforcement and community groups can set up tables, and it's for the community to get to know them. Did I say that well? Well, I printed it off. Yeah, that's what it is. So we're gonna be there.
Yes.
So it's from 4 to 7, and if you just want to come, be present, that would be a lot of fun. So you should have gotten a giving brochure today talking about some of the cool things God's done in our church. In July, this summer, we have celebrated 10 members of our church trusting Jesus in baptism. Woo! That's pretty cool, yeah. And and I just want you to know, when you support this thing, stuff like that gets to happen, and I'm really grateful for you in that. This month, our giving focus is a little different than it has been in the past. We're going to, our college ministry loves to partner with Lock Haven in, we show up and sometimes help do first Friday, events to help welcome freshmen on campus, and we go to club fairs. But this month, what college ministry has decided to do is to kind of turn the light outward from their own ministry onto a ministry that is owned by the university called the Haven Cupboard. And the Haven Cupboard helps meet food insecurity among college students at Lock Haven University. Somewhere between 40 and 50% of students struggle financially to feed themselves. And you might not think of that, but think about it. When you were a college student, you didn't have a whole lot of money, right? And you were eating ramen noodles all the time. And so
peanut butter and jelly.
And peanut butter and jelly, that's right. And so our hope is to raise $500 just to give it to them. Not for our own ministry, just to give it all away. And so if you want to contribute to that, you can do so by giving to the college ministry this month, and they'll designate that to the Haven Cupboard, and we will just bless what the university is doing there for college students. So I think those are all the announcements. Is that right? Yeah. All right. So kids, you can go with Jerry and Bob and Esther Grimes. I think they're breaking out the flannel graph board this week, so we're going old school. Yeah. I thought maybe I'd lose some adults there. who wanted to go experience a flannel graph. Can you turn me up, Noah? Nobody can seem to hear me. Check 1, 2. I get up higher. Okay. Like that? There we go. Okay. We're doing a series on parables. Parables are these little, there we go, are stories that Jesus told. Although they weren't particular to Jesus, other rabbis would have told parables, and Old Testament prophets told parables, but it's a way of teaching that's very interesting, and it's a story that the teacher would tell that always packed a punch. And so we've been looking each week at one of these parables and trying to catch what the big idea is that Jesus had in that. It's been a fun summer series. I've enjoyed it. Today's message is particularly for those of us who carry some level of authority in our lives, particularly spiritual authority, but it could be any kind of authority. That could be the parents in the room, or the future parents, or those who volunteer or lead a ministry, or the bosses, or the supervisors. What happens oftentimes, and maybe you've experienced this, is that as authority, it's like God gives us more authority in an area of our lives, like the weight of that can begin to get heavier on us as well. Every child that you bring into the world is like a whole nother soul you're responsible for, right? Every time you get a promotion at work, you feel the weight of the responsibility as well. And sometimes at its worst, our fingers, our hands can close around the responsibility, and it becomes almost like an idol to us. We begin to worship and claim ownership of something that in reality God just gave to us to hold for a little while. One of the reasons that we love to dedicate babies at Commonplaces is because it's this moment, it's more for the parents than it is for the baby, in which we get to say, this thing, this child that God's given to me, like I give it back. Like, I'm remembering that this is a gift from God, and this child belongs to Him. At its best, it sets us free from the idol of worshiping our kids and making them the center of our universe. But the same thing could happen in your job. As authority and responsibility grows, you begin to kind of hold on to it tightly, and you can tell this when you become paranoid about the intentions of other people, or you begin to compare yourself to others, and you look at your parenting and compare it to somebody else's parenting, or you become jealous at the success that other people have in their lives. And those are indicators in your heart that you've begun to kind of cling to something that is not meant to be the center of your universe. In fact, you're probably going to become more anxious and more filled with despair the tighter you hold on to these things. And so the parable Jesus tells today is in relationship to this happening among some religious leaders. And so to really understand it and to kind of own it for ourselves, it's helpful to apply it to places in our life that God has given us authority over. All right, so think about the places in your life that you have authority and responsibility for, and kind of listen to this parable through the lens of that. Now, today's parable comes to you at the peak of Jesus' ministry. Sometimes in Jesus' journey, for those 3 years when he was an itinerant preacher wandering around the Middle East, sometimes he's very careful to stay out of the public eye as much as possible. He could have grown a big audience and had 1 million followers on like ancient YouTube had he wanted to, but he chose not to. In fact, about the time when he would start to get a large crowd, he would just kind of slip away and go somewhere else. But as we approach the end of Jesus' life on earth and his ministry, everything comes to a pinnacle, and he has become wildly popular. He's in Jerusalem. He chooses to go to Jerusalem on their favorite national holiday called Passover. So at Passover, many, many Jewish people come kind of like back to the epicenter of their religious movement in Jerusalem. And so many people are in Jerusalem. Jesus has been doing some crazy great things. He's brought a man back to life who was dead. He's been healing people. Sometimes he just feeds 5,000 people just like that. You don't feed that many people for free and not gain some popularity, right? And so Jesus goes into Jerusalem, wildly popular. He kind of has, we literally call it the triumphal entry when he comes into Jerusalem. People are cheering and praising God. They're very excited for Jesus. And at this point, he doesn't really run, not run from it, but he embraces what is about to happen in his life. Jerusalem is packed. Now, in the story, right before the story I'm going to tell you, or the parable, Jesus has done something astonishing. And it's one of those things that you read it in your Bible and you just kind of scratch your head. And you're like, why would he do such a thing? Like, I don't quite get it. If you've ever read the story in the Bible of Jesus, at one time he's kind of hungry and he goes to a fig tree, and the fig tree doesn't have any figs on it, and he curses it, and it withers, and you're just like, that wasn't very nice, Jesus. Like, pick on something else, right? That was, as we're going to look at later today, almost like Jesus acting out a parable. It's not that he hates fig trees, but rather that demonstrated a lesson he was trying to teach. So the thing that Jesus does right before he gives this parable is he goes into the temple. Now remember, the temple is always a busy place, but particularly a busy place during the Passover. Many Jewish families have come to celebrate and to offer sacrifices for their sins, and it's just a good time. And so the temple would have been packed. And Jesus and his disciples show up, and they go on a little bit of a rampage. Jesus overturns the tables of people in the temple, because they kind of had this, they had a little bit of a racket going in the Jerusalem, in which if you wanted to go worship at the temple, you couldn't like bring your own sacrifice. You had to buy a special temple-approved sacrifice from one of the temple vendors. And Jesus goes into the temple and he kind of says, this is nonsense. This isn't how God intended for this to work. He says, this was meant to be a place of prayer, but instead you've turned it into a den of thieves. And he throws over the money changers. It's quite possible, like this, the temple's a big place, so how he pulls this off is really fascinating. It kind of demonstrates the influence that Jesus had at this point in his ministry. It's possible he shuts the sacrifice down for the evening. We don't know all the implications of this dramatic thing that Jesus does in the temple. But eventually he leaves, he and his disciples leave, and I'm sure they're back in business the very next day offering their sacrifices. And Jesus didn't mean in that moment to actually shut down the temple system. What he was saying, I think, was rather prophetically like, the way in which we're doing stuff now is about to be over because I'm bringing a new way of life to you today. Regardless, you don't show up in the temple and do stuff like that without making some enemies of the temple leaders. You can imagine if somebody else, imagine if like, I'll just pick another pastor in town. Let's just say, who should I pick on? Okay, yeah, Chad, very good. Chad Long shows up in our church and just starts flipping tables over, taking our giving box and shaking it upside down and spilling coffee on the place. And he's like, you guys have got it all wrong over here. And then he leaves. Like, we wouldn't receive that real well. That would be hard to take, right? Even if he was right. And so the temple leaders and the chief priests and the religious upper crust of society, they did not like this at all. Jesus had shown up on their turf, their territory, and had done something that they had not approved of. They never would have approved of this. And so there, as Jesus' popularity goes up, the resentment and the animosity of the religious leaders also goes up alongside him. They had put up with Jesus up to this point. He'd been a novelty and an irritation. And at times they had wanted to kill him, but now they really, really hate him. But they're kind of stuck because the people love him. They love Jesus. And so they're really, really frustrated. In fact, in Luke 19, 47 to 48, it says this, this is right after he overthrows the temple money changers. It says that he was teaching daily in the temple, the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people, so like the important leaders, they wanted to destroy him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his word. Sounds like every sermon I preach, they're just hanging. No, I'm just kidding. So you would think, right, that Jesus, and so they're thinking, Jesus has shown up on our territory, our home field advantage. Who said he could do this kind of a thing here? And so that's the very next kind of vignette that we read in the book of Luke. This is where this is all coming from today. In the book of Luke, they come to Jesus in this next scene, and they quiz him. It's like a question they ask him, trying to trick him. And they say to Jesus, who gave you authority to do this? Like, where did it come from? By what authority do you do these things? And it's a legitimate question. Like, he has just ransacked the temple for a little while. He shows up and he teaches every day in the temple, and they're wondering, like, where did this come from? Who said you could do these kinds of things? Most rabbis, if you wanted to become a religious teacher at that time, you would have learned under another rabbi. And he would have maybe given you his like stamp of approval. You know, today we go to college and we get a diploma whenever we finish college. It says you learned the things you were supposed to learn, right? Or at least you pretended to for 4 years, and you paid the money, and so now you've got a degree. Jesus, who gave you your degree? That says you could do this kind of stuff. And Jesus turns to them and he says, I'll tell you what, I'll answer your question, but I want you to answer a question for me first. You remember John the Baptist? Who gave him the authority to do what he did? And John did not do nearly the crazy things that Jesus did. John just kind of preached in the wilderness and baptized people. And they said, well, this is a tricky question. They all kind of huddled up over here and they said, listen, what do we do? If we say that God gave John the authority to teach, then Jesus is going to ask us why we didn't believe him, because we didn't believe him. We were quite happy when Herod killed him. But if we say John he's just a crazy man, made up his own stuff, then all the people are going to kill us because the people really like John. And so Jesus kind of turns the tables on them in this moment and asks them a question to stump them just like they had tried to stump him. And they're like, listen, we don't know where John got his authority. And Jesus says, well, I'm not going to tell you where I get my authority from either. If you want to answer my question, I won't answer your question. But then, immediately after that, he tells them this parable. In other words, it's as if he's saying, I'm not going to answer your question, but I'll tell you a story that will answer your question. And so here, with all of that in the background, we get to this parable. So the tension is thick. Jesus is in the temple, perhaps later in the day or the next day from when he has kind of made a mess of the place with his disciples. He's been teaching there. He's got a large following of people. The religious leaders hate him. The air is thick. In fact, after Jesus tells this parable, verse 19 of Luke 20 says this: the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. So they know that this parable is towards them. This is what has made writing this message a little bit hard, because oftentimes the messages of the parables are kind of related to the broader audience of people following Jesus. This one was very pointed towards these religious leaders. So let me read the parable for you. It's not very long, and then we'll talk about it. So in Luke 20, verse 9, it says this: he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent a third. And this one they wounded and they cast him out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What should I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let's kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." Okay. I want to start off by saying that this parable would have sounded very familiar to everybody listening that day, because this is like a variation on a theme from a parable that the prophet Isaiah told in Isaiah chapter 5. In Isaiah 5, the prophet tells a story about God as an owner of a vineyard who builds this vineyard and builds a nice wall around it and puts a nice wine press in it and gives it the best land, and it's a wonderful vineyard. And then, of all things, the vineyard doesn't produce good grapes. It produces bad grapes, wild grapes, and God comes in and destroys the vineyard. And in the parable that Isaiah tells, he's very clear that this vineyard represents Israel, and that Israel had not lived up to their potential. They had disobeyed God. And so all of Israel would have grown up with this story. They would have known this parable. It was familiar to them. The religious leaders certainly would have known this parable. And so Jesus takes a familiar story, but he adds a twist to it. Imagine if, it would be like, I told you that we all know, for instance, say the parable of the little boy who cried wolf, right? We're trying to teach our kids to be honest, and so we're like, listen, if you don't tell the truth, let me tell you a story about a little boy who didn't tell the truth, and he got gobbled up by a wolf, right? That's what they're learning about today, actually, in kids ministry. No, it's not. But halfway through that story, I add some new characters, and I kind of keep the main idea, but I change it a little bit and make it my own. That's what Jesus does in this story. He takes a familiar parable, and then he begins to make a variation on that theme. But all of the audience would have known he's talking about Israel and about the people responsible for the care of Israel, namely these religious leaders. The premise is similar. God is the owner, and Israel is the vineyard. So the root problem that Jesus is bringing out in this parable is that the tenants, the people responsible for caring for the garden, for the vineyard, had forgotten their role. They started to think that they were owners rather than tenants. This vineyard didn't belong to them. They were just meant to care for it for a while on behalf of the landowner. So I want you to, for a minute, think through the places of your life that you have authority and influence. Do you lead your family? Do you volunteer in a ministry? Do you have authority in the workplace, right? As we said in the beginning, there's always a tendency wherever authority is granted for us to begin to kind of hold on to it more closely and tightly than God intended. Now, when we are healthy emotionally and spiritually, knowing that we don't own that thing is actually really freeing to us, because it means that my kids belong to Jesus. My responsibilities as a pastor, this church is not mine. If I get hit by a bus tomorrow, you'll still have church next week. You might be a little sad, but you'll still have church. Somebody else will do this, right? This is bigger than me. It's okay, but I'm not planning on getting hit by a bus. But there's a sense of freedom in that when we come to understand that what we have been given is just for us to hold for a time. When we're unhealthy emotionally and spiritually, we view others as threats. We have an air of suspicion around the motives of other people. Some of you are in work environments like this where you always are convinced someone's gunning for your job, and maybe they really, really are. I don't know. But the overriding emotion that runs your life is fear. That's what was behind these leaders. They can't answer Jesus' question regarding John's authority because they were afraid of the people. They won't arrest Jesus in daylight because they were afraid of the people. Jesus, however, in this whole story is wonderfully differentiated from the fear of man. He's unconcerned of people's perception of him. He only cares what the Father thinks of him. At our best, that's how we live our lives. Not that we want to be thought of poorly by others, but we care most of all about what God thinks of us rather than the opinions of others. And really, the religious leaders ought to be celebrating Jesus. In the last 3 years, Jesus has taken the spiritual temperature of the nation of Israel and taken it up a notch. People were thinking about God in ways they hadn't thought about God. Sick people were not sick anymore. They were made well. People, I imagine, had a renewed interest in studying the Old Testament. This was good for Israel, and yet all they can do is interpret Jesus' ministry as a threat to them. As a threat. So find yourself in that scenario. What are the places that you have authority or influence over? And has that place become something that you've kind of held onto more tightly than you should have? So the next point that really, we talk often about how the centerpiece of a parable is the gotcha moment. That there's always a twist in the story, something that the original hearer would have said, I can't believe he would do that. So what's the twist in this story? Well, Kenneth Bailey, who wrote a book called Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes, was really helpful in helping me to understand this parable and many of the parables that we've talked about. But the owner of this vineyard acts all backwards from the way that any normal, respectable vineyard owner would have. For instance, when Jesus tells the parable, every time he sends a servant and the servant gets, sent away, the treatment gets worse on the person, right? It would be as if I have a tenant that I need to collect rent from, and so I send Wes Alexander. He's a police officer. Certainly he can collect rent for me. And Wes goes there, and they kind of rough him up a little bit, and they send him away, and he comes back to like, they didn't give me your rent. In fact, they kind of pushed me around a little bit. And so I'm like, I know what I'll do. I'll send Jerry. And so I send Jerry, and it says that the second one, they rough him up and they shame him. So they give Jerry a wedgie, and they call him names, and then they send him away. Jerry's in kids ministry. I can pick on him today, right? And so it gets worse. And then I'm like, oh man, they didn't pay rent to Wes, and they wouldn't pay Jerry. I know what I'll do. I'll send Andy Sprout, right? So I send Andy, and they beat Andy up so bad I have to call an ambulance to get him back, right? No rent, nothing at all. Who on earth would, first of all, ever let the situation get to this point, right? Any normal landowner, and Jesus' audience would have known this, that at the very first rebuttal, the first time they refused to pay rent, you would have called the authorities or rallied your own small army and marched down there and taken care of business. But that's not what this guy does. And so finally, I'd say, well, Wes couldn't get rent, and Jerry couldn't get rent, and Andy couldn't get rent. I know what I'll do. I'll send my beloved son, Isaac. Certainly he can get rent for me, right? They'll respect him. And they kill the son, right? Everybody in Jesus' audience that day would have been both astonished, first of all, at the audacity of the vineyard tenants for responding in this way, but even more so in the way in which the landowner would give multiple opportunities to these hooligans. Nobody would act this way. Kenneth Bailey says that at every moment that the landowner experiences anger over the mistreatment of his messengers, he always reprocesses that anger into grace. And so what Jesus is implying to these religious leaders is time and time again, God has brought prophets to you that you refuse to listen to. And let's face it, most recently, John the Baptist, because that's who Jesus just mentioned. And you refused to listen to them. How patient God has been. No vineyard owner would ever have taken the approach of God. All he does is extend grace upon grace to you. In Hebrew storytelling, they don't put the big moment at the end of the story like we do, right? My grandma used to read a book and then get halfway through and read the last 2 pages because she just wanted to know how it ended, right? Well, you couldn't do that in good Hebrew literature because they always wrote their storylines in this mirroring fashion with the aha moment at the middle of it, like the meat of the parable was in the middle. And in this case, if you were to diagram this out, the aha moment here is when the vineyard owner sends his beloved son, right? Oh man, this isn't just a story about a vineyard owner. This is the gospel story of God sending his son. Wow. I've way gone off my notes. I don't know where I am now. So, for those of us, this is actually encouraging, because for those of us who maybe felt a little beat up by the last point and thought, yeah, I do kind of hold on too tightly to what God has given to me, the good news is that we serve a gracious God who gives time and time again far more than we deserve, so much so that he would send his own son on our behalf. Now, I was a little bit stumped by the part of the story when when the tenants say, let's kill the son so that we would get the inheritance. That doesn't make any sense to me. Who would think that way? If you murder my son, I'm going to give you my son's inheritance, right? Well, it could be meant as hyperbole, like the idea being that Jesus has told a story in which the vineyard owner has acted in an absurd but grace-filled manner. And so also the tenants are being portrayed in an equally absurd but selfish way. And often Jesus would do this, tell outrageous stories in which there was a lot of compare and contrast in it. It was also possible that there was this kind of squatters' rights law in the first century of Israel, in which if you kind of lived on the land for 3 years, it could be yours. But regardless, it's obvious that Jesus is pointing out the selfishness of the tenants in contrast to the grace of the landowner. Every time he extends grace, they throw it back to him. Now, the next part of this parable that had me a little bit stumped was the response. Can you guys put up like the verse 16 for me? And after Jesus tells the parable, the response of the audience is, surely not. Surely not. Why would he do this, right? So verse 16. And I asked myself, first of all, who's saying that? Is it the audience, the larger audience of the people there who just love and hang on every word that Jesus has said? And it could be that as ancient Hebrew listeners, they would have known that the story was a little bit absurd. And they would have been like, surely not. No landowner would send his own son to that situation. But I'm inclined to think that the surely not is actually the religious leaders. And they're not responding to the love of the landowner. They're actually responding to the last phrase, which says, he will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyards to others. And the reason I think that is because it says right after that, he looked directly at them. So someone in the audience he singles out and looks at in that moment. And we know that the religious leaders identify that they're the main subjects of this story. The religious leaders this is the part that I can't quite understand. They are starting, like the things are opening up in their mind. They're understanding parts of the story they've never seen before, and it is rubbing them the wrong way. They realize that Jesus is calling out their own rejection of him time and time again. They were beginning to understand that Jesus was self-identifying as the Son of God. But what is most shocking to them is not that God would show extravagant love to them, but the idea that God would remove them from their privileged roles and give that to someone else. Who would he give that to? Could it be that ragtag group of disciples that had just shut down the temple the day before? Certainly not. Not guys like Matthew, a former tax collector, or Peter, a fisherman, just the ordinary men. They loved their authority. They loved their privilege. And they could not imagine a scenario in which they were not in charge. And the thought of that happening filled them with such bitterness and hatred that they begin to plot the death of Jesus. They're more astonished at losing their power than they are at the love of God towards them. Now, at the very end of this, as Jesus looks at them, he says, what then is this that is written? Go to the next verse. And then he quotes to them a verse from the book of Psalms. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So for us today, it's like, was Jesus getting his metaphors all mixed up? First we're talking about agriculture, and now we're talking about cornerstones. But for the listeners that day, Jesus, this is just another variation on a theme. He's explaining to them that he's taking texts that they loved and helping them to understand it in a prophetic way. You religious leaders have rejected me, but it turns out I'm the cornerstone of this faith. Think about this. Just like I made a big demonstration yesterday in the temple around its destruction, someday I'm going to build a new temple that will be rooted on me. You think you can crush me with your plots, but really your rejection of me will become your destruction. And then they are very angry, as you can imagine, and they begin to figure out, how can we end this guy? We understand, if you look at the scope of Jesus' life, we know that his death for us was part of God's redemptive plan for humanity, and that the atonement was in there. But when you look at it on the micro level, you begin to understand how Jesus enters into Jerusalem and then within a week is murdered. It's because he did things like this. He said things like this that completely infuriated the people with authority around him, and they began to plot his death. So how do you end a sermon like this, right? This is a tough one. You figure it out. The end. No. I have a couple final thoughts. One is what I've been saying from the very beginning. Don't behave like the religious leaders. Don't let your hands wrap so tightly around what has been entrusted to you that you forget who it really belongs to. Good tells in your heart is when you become threatened or anxious about other people. Use that as a heart check in those moments. Another thing is Jesus is not at all confused about his authority. He recognizes who he is and what he's about to do. And then an encouragement for us as well. The centerpiece of this story is the radical grace of God. It was most certainly the gotcha moment for everyone that heard it that day. That God would live out radical grace despite when he turns his anger into grace over and over and over again. The weight of responsibility is heavy, but the grace of a loving God can make it light. I think this is behind Jesus when he says, come to me, everybody who's weary and heavy laden, and I'm going to give you rest. And then he says, take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So it's like, how can working for Jesus be light? It's because we recognize that it's his. Everything belongs to him. It's not ours. Imagine if Jesus could have told a different parable that day. Imagine if the vineyard tenant farmers had instead leveraged the lavish grace of the landowner to make their vineyard flourish, rather than trying to hold it all for themselves. And imagine what God can do in your life and in the place that you have authority and you have influence. If rather than seeing people as threats and rather than holding tightly to what God has given to you, you instead release it to him and allow his generous grace to empower you in your life in whatever area you have authority and influence. And I have to think that the same God that sent his son is going to also empower you and give you the grace that you need in whatever scenario you find yourself in as well. And so that is the lesson of the vineyard. I'm going to pray for us and we'll conclude with some songs. Heavenly Father, I thank you for being a God of lavish grace. You constantly reframe what could have been anger into love on my behalf. And if nothing else, may we leave today deeply grateful for the fact that you sent your Son as the centerpiece of your love for us. In the places where we are inclined to hold tightly to what you have entrusted to us, I ask that you would set us free to hold with open hands all the places of influence and authority, whether that's our children or our jobs or our ministries, and to know that you take good care of everything that's yours. In Jesus' name, I pray this. Amen.
It's on clear. Gotcha.
Please rise if you're able. Where was the darkness when hope was restored? Where was despair when my God split the shores? Where was defeat when the Lord took a breath? When he stood in power by the grave that he left? Nowhere, Nowhere, nowhere is the fear when my King resurrects. Nowhere, nowhere, nowhere was the doubt when my King conquered death. Where was the sorrow when dry bones arose? And where was the pain when the sick touched the road? And where was disgrace when the King laid to rest down the stronghold of sin by the grace he possessed? It was nowhere, nowhere, nowhere is the fear when my King resurrects. Nowhere, nowhere, nowhere was the doubt when my King conquered death. I see joy rising, I hear hope calling, I see fear hiding, I hear chains falling, I see walls shaking, I hear doubt running. 'Cause my God's on his way, yes he is coming. I see joy rising, I hear hope calling, I see fear hiding, I hear chains falling, I see walls shaking, I hear doubt running. 'Cause my God's on his way, yes he is coming. Now here, now here, now here, now here in his presence my shame disappears. Now here, now here, oh I stand undefeated when Jesus is near. And now here, now here, now here in his presence my shame disappears. Now here, now here, oh I stand undefeated when Jesus is near. I see joy rising, I hear hope calling, I see fear hiding, I hear chains falling, I see walls shaking, I hear doubt running. 'Cause my God's on his way, yes he is coming. I see joy rising, I hear hope calling, I see fear hiding, I hear chains falling, I see walls shaking, I hear doubt running. 'Cause my God's on his way, yes he is coming. And I searched the world, but it couldn't fill me. A man's empty praise, treasures that fade are never enough. But then you came along and put me back together. And every desire is now satisfied here in your love. Oh, there's nothing better than you. No, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing, and nothing is better than you. and I'm not afraid to show you my weakness, my failures and flaws. Lord, you've seen them all, and you still call me friend. 'Cause the God of the mountain is the God of the valley, and there's not a place your mercy and grace won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. No, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing, nothing is better than you. You turn mourning to dancing. Oh, you give beauty for ashes. Oh, you turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn mourning to dancing. Oh, you give beauty for ashes. Oh, you turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. Praise into gardens. You turn praise into gardens. Oh, you turn bones into armies. Oh, you turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. Oh, there's nothing better than you. No, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing, nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. No, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing, nothing is better than you. I see joy rising, I hear hope calling, I see fear hiding, I hear chains falling, I see walls shaking, I hear doubt running. It's my God's on his way. Yes, he is coming. I see joy rising, I hear hope calling, I see fear hiding, I hear chains falling, I see walls shaking, I hear doubt running. It's my God's on his way. Yes, he is coming. Oh, there's nothing better than you. No, there's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing, and nothing is better than you. Let's do that one more time. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing, and nothing is better than you. great love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea. In the silence, you won't let go. In the questions, your truth will hold. Your great love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, I will follow you. My lighthouse, I will trust the promise. You will carry me safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. I won't fear what tomorrow brings. With each morning I'll rise and sing. My God's love will lead me through. You are the peace in my troubled sea. Whoa, you are the peace in my troubled sea. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, I will follow you. My lighthouse, I will trust the promise. You will carry me safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. Far before us, you're the brightest. You will lead us through the storms. Far before us, you're the brightest. You will lead us through the storms. Far before us, you're the brightest. You will lead us through the storms. My lighthouse, shining in the darkness, you will follow you. My lighthouse, I will trust the promise. You will carry me safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. Safe to shore. All right, God bless everybody. Go out in peace and enjoy your week.